Imagine stepping off a ship, your uniform dusty from desert campaigns, expecting nothing but hardship, deprivation, and humiliation, and instead being greeted by a world that seems almost impossibly vibrant. German soldiers in 1943, freshly captured in North Africa, experienced this shock firsthand as they arrived in the United States. For years, they had been fed a carefully constructed narrative that America was weak, decadent, and incapable of waging a serious war. But what they witnessed with their own eyes told a completely different story. As the train carrying them through the American heartland rumbled along the tracks, every small town seemed to glow with electric lights, illuminating streets, homes, and businesses late into the night. Factories hummed with activity, and fields were dotted with machinery that moved as if by magic, accomplishing in hours what would take weeks back home for men who had endured scarcity, rationing, and constant propaganda that painted the enemy as struggling and desperate. This was more than surprising, it was deeply unsettling. The first sensory shocks were simple yet profound. Warm, well-prepared meals, fresh bread, coffee, and meat served in quantities they had not seen in months. Hospitals equipped with modern tools, and even penicillin seemed almost fantastical. A stark contrast to the scarcity and suffering they had known. This was not punishment, nor was it a show designed to mock them. It was the ordinary operation of a society that had built its strength through organization, innovation, and abundance. Every corner of American life they observed, from bustling ports to mechanized farms, was a lesson in a reality their propaganda-fed minds could scarcely grasp. But beyond material abundance, there was another revelation. Americans treated them with a level of humanity that was profoundly disarming. Officers spoke to them in fluent German, explained their rights under the Geneva Convention, and ensured their safety and comfort during transport and in camp life. This was a new kind of power, one that did not rely solely on weapons or armies, but on efficiency, civility, and the ability to create prosperity on a scale that seemed endless. It was a living argument against the beliefs they had been taught to hold sacred. As they gazed out of train windows, wandered through camp streets, and witnessed the rhythm of everyday life in a nation untouched by the immediate horrors of the battlefield, a quiet transformation began. Ideals of superiority, racial hierarchy, and absolute obedience began to crack under the weight of evidence. These soldiers were learning, unwillingly but undeniably, that strength could coexist with kindness, and that a nation's power was measured not just by its ability to destroy, but by its ability to sustain and nurture. Join us as we dive deeper into this extraordinary story, exploring how the seemingly simple realities of food, light, and human decency systematically dismantled the ideology of an entire army. Hit the like button if you enjoy uncovering history from new angles. And do not forget to subscribe for more fascinating insights from the untold chapters of our past. The desert sun had barely begun its descent on May 13, 1943, when the once proud banners of the Wehrmacht and their Italian allies were lowered in Tunisia, signaling a defeat that would echo far beyond the barren sands they had fought over. For soldiers hardened by years of relentless campaigns, the surrender was not just a military loss, but the first tangible crack in the foundation of everything they had been taught to believe. The myth of invincibility, carefully nurtured by years of propaganda and battlefield glory, began to unravel in the harshest of classrooms. Reality itself. Men who had endured the merciless North African heat, who had charged against entrenched enemies and survived ambushes, now found themselves disarmed, surrounded, and transported from the very terrain they had considered their proving ground to an entirely foreign world that would challenge every assumption they held about power, authority, and human capability. Among the captured were veterans who had seen the British Army pushed to the brink and Italian comrades who had once been fellow conspirators in conquest, now turned witnesses to their own vulnerability. In the shifting sands of defeat, their diaries recorded not just strategy and loss, but a dawning awareness that the ideals of racial supremacy and national superiority were fragile constructs. Unable to withstand the evidence of failure, every step toward surrender carried with it the weight of a long-accumulated pride. Yet with it came the first taste of cognitive dissonance, a seed of doubt planted in minds trained to obey without question. The desert itself seemed to whisper the truth. That valor alone could not sustain ideology when confronted with a force that combined logistical brilliance, industrial might, and a society built on resilience rather than fear. As these soldiers were gathered and processed at ports in Algeria, the initial exposure to American order and efficiency further complicated their perception of the enemy. The meticulous registration, medical examination, and issuance of identification were conducted with an almost mechanical precision, yet with a calm courtesy that was profoundly alien. Officers spoke in fluent German, explaining rights guaranteed under international conventions, a gesture that seemed at once baffling and disarming. The men, trained to view every interaction with the enemy as a potential threat, began to realize that this was not deception but a manifestation of a system that functioned according to principles entirely unlike their own. Where organization, foresight, and human dignity could coexist, the surrender in Tunisia was no longer just a chapter in a military campaign. It became the threshold to a psychological journey that would confront them with a reality they could neither ignore nor fully comprehend. The first nights aboard the ships transporting them across the Atlantic became a crucible of this transformation. Liberty ships, enormous yet surprisingly efficient vessels, carried these men in conditions that were orderly and surprisingly comfortable, with meals abundant enough to make them question every story they had been told about American scarcity. The very act of observing waste, the discarding of half-eaten bread, cartons of milk, and slabs of meat was not meant to insult but revealed the sheer scale of resources that a society could muster. Each meal, each routine inspection, and each orderly interaction chipped away at the framework of belief that had sustained them through campaigns that now seemed distant and irrelevant. The surrender had initiated a chain of events that would not merely restrain them physically, but begin to educate them in a language of power they had never spoken before, a language written in efficiency, abundance, and calm authority rather than the harsh cadence of military command. Upon arrival at American camps in Texas and Oklahoma, the full implications of their surrender became unmistakably clear. The barracks were organized like miniature towns, constructed with care and attention to comfort, providing electric lighting, heat, plumbing, and modern medical facilities. Soldiers accustomed to desert rations and rudimentary shelters found themselves navigating kitchens with refrigeration, running water, and equipment that turned the preparation of meals into an industrial process. Hospitals offered treatments that had been inaccessible for years, including the administration of penicillin for conditions that had previously meant infection and suffering. It was a daily, undeniable demonstration that the enemy they had been taught to fear as weak, desperate, and disorganized was, in truth, a society capable of producing abundance, maintaining order, and extending human dignity even to those who had sought to destroy it. Even more profound was the exposure to American civilian life and labor. POWs were sent to work in farms, factories, and processing plants, witnessing mechanized agriculture that could accomplish in hours what would take hundreds of men-days in Europe, assembly lines that produced vehicles and machinery with astonishing efficiency, and towns where ordinary citizens enjoyed a standard of living that seemed unimaginable. These were not elite administrators or party officials but farmers, factory workers, and townspeople whose prosperity and capability were achieved through ingenuity, hard work, and systems designed to empower rather than intimidate. The surrender in Tunisia, which had seemed to mark the end of their agency, had instead opened a window onto a broader lesson, that the true measure of a society's strength was not merely its ability to wage war, but its capacity to sustain life, innovation, and dignity on a massive scale. The psychological unraveling that began with surrender was subtle but relentless. Soldiers who had entered captivity with rigid ideas of hierarchy, racial superiority, and absolute obedience gradually confronted a world that functioned on entirely different principles. They saw systems that rewarded skill over pedigree, compassion over cruelty, and ingenuity over rigid tradition. They read newspapers, attended lectures, and observed debates on governance and reconstruction, realizing that knowledge and freedom could coexist with power in a way they had never been allowed to imagine. The surrender in Tunisia had thus been more than a military defeat. It was the entry point to an education in the true nature of societal power. An education delivered not through ideology or coercion, but through lived experience, observation, and the quiet demonstration of efficiency and humanity. By the time the prisoners returned to Germany after the war, the lessons of surrender and captivity had been indelibly imprinted. Men who had once fought under the banner of invincibility carried with them an understanding of industrial capability, social organization, and democratic principles that would shape reconstruction efforts and the eventual economic revival of their homeland. The surrender in Tunisia had set in motion a journey that transformed warriors into witnesses and, ultimately, into agents of change, proving that the impact of defeat is measured not only in territory lost or lives sacrificed, but in the profound reshaping of the mind and the vision of what is possible when a society harmonizes power with compassion. As the surrendered German and Italian soldiers were guided off the ships in the warm, humid air of Algerian ports, they encountered an experience entirely unlike any battlefield encounter they had known, a reality that began to slowly, inexorably dismantle the worldview they had carried with them into war, where they had expected chaos, disorder, and the brusque, impersonal handling of prisoners. They found instead a level of organization that bordered on the uncanny, a system that was both precise and humane in a manner entirely foreign to men trained to survive under fear, scarcity, and strict hierarchical command. From the very first moments, the American military began to speak to them in a language of meticulous structure, where every action had a purpose and every detail had been anticipated. Identification cards were issued with care, photographs were taken with efficiency, and medical examinations were conducted with an exacting precision that left the men both bewildered and increasingly aware that their own systems of military administration, which they had always assumed superior, fell far short of this standard. The officers responsible for this processing did not bark orders or wield authority with intimidation. They explained every step in fluent German, calmly informing the prisoners of their rights under the Geneva Convention, a concept that, for many, had existed in theory only on paper or in abstract, distant lectures. Each conversation, each carefully articulated instruction, was a lesson in the power of clarity, discipline, and foresight. The soldiers could not help but notice that this was not improvisation. It was a carefully engineered procedure, a symphony of bureaucracy that functioned with a rhythm and precision that made the disorganized chaos of the European camps they had seen seem almost primitive. In these moments, the men began to perceive that military might was not only a matter of weapons, tactics, or fear, but also of an infrastructure so finely tuned that the movement, sustenance, and care of tens of thousands of human beings could occur seamlessly, without confusion or unnecessary hardship. What struck them most profoundly, however, was not the efficiency alone, but the humanity embedded within it. The soldiers were fed, counted, examined, and registered with a combination of rigor and courtesy that defied expectation. No detail was overlooked, yet no step was demeaning. The captives were treated as individuals whose rights and well-being mattered, even as they remained technically enemies of the state. The paradox was disorienting. They had been trained to see the enemy as a collection of faceless adversaries to be conquered, starved, and subdued. Yet here was an enemy that wielded power not to humiliate but to maintain order and protect life. As they moved from one station to another, they could not ignore the rhythm of the operation, the precision of the clerks, the methodical handling of forms, the quiet efficiency of medical officers who checked each prisoner with care, ensuring no injury or illness went unnoticed. Every step of this process was a lesson, a demonstration that power and compassion need not be mutually exclusive. Even the most disciplined and indoctrinated officers among them found themselves grappling with a subtle, growing disbelief. Lieutenant Friedrich Racker, a veteran who had survived multiple campaigns in North Africa, recorded in his diary the strange combination of admiration and unease that filled him as he watched American clerks meticulously log the details of thousands of prisoners in a matter of hours. He wrote of the impossible orderliness, the lack of panic, the calm certainty that every action was accounted for, and the uncanny way that these officers seemed to anticipate every possible complication before it arose. In his experience, such coordination would have required months of preparation in Germany. Yet here it was being executed flawlessly in real time. The contrast was jarring, and with each passing hour, the cracks in the ideological armor they had carried into captivity widened ever further. This immersion into American efficiency extended beyond paperwork and processing lines. The POWs observed the care with which meals were prepared and distributed, the way that medical attention was prioritized, and the quiet attention given to the smallest details of living conditions. Men who had once endured weeks of insufficient rations marveled at the regularity and abundance provided without ceremony or spectacle. Those who had survived brutal desert campaigns noted that their captors' concern for their well-being was not a trick, a temporary measure, or propaganda. It was the natural functioning of a society with systems designed to sustain, rather than merely dominate. The psychological effect was subtle but profound. Discipline and organization, once abstract concepts linked to power and fear, now revealed themselves as instruments of persuasion, demonstrating that competence, clarity, and care could reshape perceptions far more effectively than intimidation or brute force. As days turned into weeks, the prisoners' exposure to this system continued to erode the certainty with which they had held to notions of superiority and inevitability. Each procedural interaction, each meal served on schedule, each medical examination conducted with skill, reinforced the realization that the Americans' power was not a fragile veneer but a deeply embedded structural reality. They began to understand that efficiency and humanity were not opposing forces. On the contrary, they were complementary, each reinforcing the other to create a society capable of sustaining both men's military might and an ethical conduct toward those who had once been considered enemies. The meticulous processing, which had seemed at first mundane and procedural, became, in retrospect, one of the most effective instruments of education the soldiers had ever experienced, a quiet, systemic unveiling of a truth far greater than any lecture or propaganda campaign could convey. By the time they were transported further inland to the camps of Texas and Oklahoma, the lesson was already well underway. They had witnessed, in hours and days of processing, a power that was at once efficient, disciplined, and humane. challenging the very assumptions that had underpinned their loyalty to a regime that demanded sacrifice, obedience, and the denial of empathy. The organizational mastery of the American military, expressed in forms, examinations, and careful attention to the smallest details, became the gateway through which these men began to perceive a larger reality, a world where power was measured not just in victories on the battlefield, but in the capacity to manage, protect, and sustain human life with precision and care. And in this realization, the seeds of transformation were planted, quietly, inexorably, and irreversibly, as the German prisoners settled into the rhythm of life in the American processing camps. They were confronted with a reality that defied every expectation they had carried across the ocean, a reality that slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to dismantle the values and assumptions that had guided their lives as soldiers of the Third Reich. In Norfolk, they had endured the relentless sun, the endless stretches of sand, and the constant threat of ambush, subsisting on meager rations that were rationed with military precision, where hunger and scarcity were considered virtues, and the endurance of suffering was celebrated as proof of loyalty and strength. Yet now, in the heart of a country they had been taught to despise, they were met not with deprivation, humiliation, or indifference, but with abundance, comfort, and care in quantities that seemed almost surreal. Each day brought meals that were not just sufficient, but generous, white bread soft and fresh, meat served in portions that would have been unimaginable on the African front, coffee rich and hot, fruits and vegetables that had been long absent from their diets. The soldiers, initially suspicious and wary, began to realize that this was not a show, a temporary indulgence designed to confuse or demoralize them. It was the standard of daily life, and it was indisputably real. The camps themselves were more than mere shelters. They were structured communities that embodied the principles of organization, hygiene, and dignity. Barracks stood in neat rows, constructed with materials and care that contrasted sharply with the crude and often makeshift accommodations they had known in the desert. Each building was outfitted with electricity, heating, and plumbing, a standard that seemed almost decadent to men who had spent years enduring sand-scorched tents and rationed water. Bathrooms were equipped with running water and flush toilets. Showers were hot and plentiful, and even small comforts, once reserved for officers or the privileged, were available to ordinary soldiers. These were not luxuries meant to reward obedience or curry favor. They were baseline standards, built into a system designed to sustain human life and well-being. The realization struck them with a force greater than any artillery barrage. The society that had so successfully resisted them on the battlefield was capable of producing abundance not through caution or cruelty, but through planning, innovation, and efficiency. Medical care, too, was a revelation that challenged the moral and practical assumptions the prisoners had carried into captivity. Field hospitals in Tunisia had been rudimentary at best, often overwhelmed and starved for supplies, where infections could mean permanent disability or death, and where even minor injuries were endured with stoic resignation. In contrast, the camp hospitals were modern, well-equipped, and staffed by doctors who treated injuries and illnesses with a thoroughness that was both impressive and unsettling. Penicillin, a drug they had only heard of in rumors and legends, was administered freely, curing infections that might have been fatal back home. Each medical intervention, each attentive checkup, underscored a simple yet profound truth. The enemy they had been taught to fear as desperate and struggling was in fact a society capable of marshalling resources on a scale that allowed care, not punishment, to be extended to those who had been actively attempting to destroy them. The soldiers could not ignore the contrast between the suffering they had been accustomed to and the well-being they now experienced. It created a cognitive dissonance that undermined the very foundations of the ideology they had been trained to uphold. The kitchens became another arena of revelation, where the prisoners witnessed processes that bordered on industrial precision. With refrigerators, mixers, and storage designed to ensure both efficiency and surplus, meals were prepared in quantities that accounted not just for survival, but for comfort, taste, and even redundancy, ensuring that every soldier received his full ration and that nothing essential was withheld. Yet this abundance carried with it a subtle psychological weight. The excess that could not be consumed was discarded, not out of spite, but because the systems were designed to guarantee that no shortage would ever occur. Men who had known the sharp edges of hunger and the discipline of scarcity were forced to confront the fact that abundance was not a threat, but a statement of capability. A demonstration that a society could generate and distribute resources on a scale that rendered deprivation a choice rather than necessity. The act of throwing away food, bread, meat, and milk that would have been treasured in any European household was initially shocking, almost incomprehensible. Yet it drove home the magnitude of industrial and agricultural power they were witnessing firsthand. Even beyond sustenance and shelter, the daily routines, from work assignments to leisure, highlighted a society functioning on principles of planning, fairness, and respect for human dignity. POWs assigned to various duties, cleaning, cooking, and even supervised labor on farms encountered tools, machinery, and infrastructure that amplified human effort to a degree they had never imagined. A single combine could harvest fields that would have taken an entire regiment weeks to complete, and the systems of coordination and labor efficiency were evident at every turn. Soldiers who had believed that hardship was necessary for moral fortitude were confronted with a contradictory reality. The strength of a society could be measured not in deprivation endured, but in the scale, speed, and care with which human needs were met and productivity achieved. Each day became a lesson in the paradoxical power of generosity, abundance, and technological competence, dismantling the idea that scarcity was a virtue and that suffering conferred superiority. By the time the prisoners began to internalize these experiences, the lessons were undeniable and profound. They had crossed oceans and continents only to discover that the enemy they had feared and loathed could sustain life, innovation, and order on a scale that made the sacrifices and deprivations they had once considered heroic seem arbitrary. Meals, medicine, and living conditions were not gestures of condescension but embodiments of a societal philosophy that merged efficiency with humanity, a philosophy that left them simultaneously awed, unsettled, and reconsidering the very principles on which they had built their service and loyalty. In the quiet reflection of camp evenings, as they sat together sharing stories of the battlefield and the world they had left behind, the realization dawned with irresistible clarity. The true power of a society was not measured in fear or domination but in the capacity to provide, sustain, and nurture. And this understanding would remain with them long after they left the camps, shaping their perception of the world and their role within it in ways that no propaganda, victory, or defeat could have ever achieved. As the German prisoners of war crossed the Atlantic toward the United States, the journey itself became a revelation, an unspoken lesson in the magnitude of American industrial capability that slowly, inexorably began to erode the assumptions they had carried with them from the battlefields of Tunisia and North Africa. From the moment they boarded the massive Liberty ships, vessels whose construction had been timed and executed with a precision that seemed almost inconceivable, The scale of what they were witnessing challenged every preconception about the enemy they had been trained to fear and despise. This Robert Peary, which they now called home for the weeks of their voyage, had been assembled in a staggering 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes, a feat that defied the very logic of what they had believed possible in shipbuilding. As these ships crossed the ocean, ferrying human cargo with the same effortless efficiency as they transported tons of material supplies, the prisoners began to see that the American capacity for production was not only vast but systematic, almost inexhaustible, and designed to maintain momentum regardless of the pressures of war. Every day on the ship was a lesson in abundance and scale, from the storage of food and fuel to the rhythm of operations that seemed almost choreographed. Prisoners watched in disbelief as sailors managed supplies and daily life with an ease that made hardship seem optional, witnessing mountains of food, gallons of milk, and stacks of bread being moved, prepared, and sometimes even discarded without a second thought, an expression of the nation's capacity to generate resources faster than any army could consume them. It was not cruelty, nor a display of superiority meant to intimidate, but a simple reality. America had designed its systems to ensure that nothing essential would ever be lacking, and that efficiency could coexist with abundance on a scale that the German officers had never seen, even in the most well-resourced areas of their own military. The technological sophistication aboard these ships added another layer of astonishment. Radar systems, which they had been taught were the exclusive domain of elite navies and a closely guarded secret, rotated above the ship's bridge as a matter of course, offering real-time awareness of the surrounding waters. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Staubbern, a career officer from an aristocratic German military family, recorded in his diary the profound dissonance this created. Technology that Germany had regarded as unattainable or tightly restricted was not only present but standardized, applied even in vessels designed primarily for logistical transport rather than combat. It became clear to him, and to many of the other officers, that their understanding of global technological hierarchies was incomplete at best, deliberately distorted at worst, and that their own nation's claims of supremacy were far more fragile than they had imagined. As the ships neared the American coast, the scale of industrial power revealed itself in a new dimension. The ports and docks of Norfolk and other Atlantic bases spread out before them in an almost overwhelming display of machinery, infrastructure, and human coordination. Electric cranes moved effortlessly, lifting and placing cargo that would require dozens of men and teams of horses in Germany, while dockworkers, ordinary men who could afford private automobiles and leisure time, managed a level of throughput that rendered the German ports of Hamburg or Bremen pale by comparison. The prisoners could not fail to notice that this was not a society straining under the burdens of war. It was a nation whose internal systems of production, transportation, and technological application were so efficient and abundant that they allowed military operations to proceed with extraordinary speed, accuracy, and adaptability. For men who had been immersed in propaganda emphasizing American weakness and deprivation, the reality was nothing short of shattering. The journey inland via rail continued to reinforce these impressions. Along the tracks, towns and industrial complexes glimmered with electricity and mechanization, revealing a society whose scale of production reached into every facet of life. Near Detroit, prisoners observed the legendary Willow Run plant, where a single factory produced a B-24 Liberator bomber every hour, the assembly line moving with relentless precision as if the machinery itself were conscious, orchestrating the movement of thousands of components into a coherent and deadly aircraft. Officers who had been taught that American equipment was hastily built and inferior now saw evidence of meticulous craftsmanship, quality control, and the capacity to scale production to levels that made conventional notions of scarcity irrelevant. every smokestack, every conveyor, every rotating crane or moving vehicle became a testament to a civilization in which industrial capacity was inseparable from national strength. Beyond the factories and ports, the prisoners saw that America's superiority was not merely technological but systemic. The decentralized production model, sourcing components from multiple states and assembling them with incredible speed, revealed a level of logistical sophistication that Germany's centralized, rigid wartime economy struggled to match. Each component, each worker, each machine contributed to a network that was resilient, flexible, and astonishingly productive. A network that rendered even the most carefully calculated German strategies of attrition almost irrelevant. As the prisoners moved through urban and rural landscapes, witnessing electric-lit streets, industrial complexes stretching for miles, and ordinary citizens operating with a level of skill, education, and access that German propaganda had claimed impossible, the cumulative psychological impact was undeniable. Their understanding of power, hierarchy, and national capability was being systematically deconstructed, piece by piece, by the very reality they were living in. By the time they arrived at the camps in Texas and Oklahoma, the prisoners carried with them a profound, unspoken lesson about the nature of national power, the sheer scale of shipbuilding, technological innovation, and industrial throughput they had observed was not an accident nor a temporary wartime phenomenon. It was the manifestation of a society that had aligned its human and material resources to achieve maximum efficiency and capability. The lesson was inescapable. The ideological myths of invincibility, racial superiority, and military inevitability that had been drilled into them for years could not survive the relentless evidence of reality. Each ship launched, each radar system observed, each factory producing at unprecedented scale, had contributed to a growing awareness that American industrial and technological superiority was not a claim but a tangible, observable force, one that would forever alter the prisoners' perception of their own nation. Their enemy, and the very nature of modern power. When the German prisoners finally disembarked from the Liberty ships and began their journey inland, the experience of captivity took on a form that was entirely alien to their expectations, a reality that seemed more akin to travel for leisure than imprisonment for war. They were ushered onto Pullman passenger trains, not the cramped, oppressive boxcars they had been conditioned to imagine, or that had characterized much of Europe's military transport, but spacious, well-appointed coaches with padded seats, dining cars complete with white tablecloths, and observation cars with panoramic windows that allowed them to gaze out across the American landscape as it unfolded in a blur of towns, farms, and industrial complexes. Officers who had been hardened by years of combat and indoctrinated with the belief that enemy treatment could only be cruel or austere found themselves seated in air-conditioned cars, marveling at the luxury and considering, in quiet disbelief, whether such comfort could truly exist outside of propaganda films or the private quarters of their own commanders. Even when minor mechanical issues arose, an air conditioner that sputtered or a dining service delayed, the sergeant in charge apologized politely. A courtesy so foreign to the harsh realities of European warfare that it seemed almost absurd. And yet it underscored a principle that would recur throughout their captivity. Efficiency, comfort, and respect were not reserved for allies or the privileged. They were baseline standards, extended even to men who had once sought to kill Americans on the battlefield. The trains themselves became rolling classrooms in the practical demonstration of American prosperity, as the prisoners pressed their faces to the windows, trying to reconcile the abundance outside with the world they had been taught to know. Small towns blazed with electric light even in the dead of night. Factories operated continuous night shifts, and parking lots overflowed with vehicles belonging to ordinary workers. Images that contradicted everything they had been told about deprivation and struggle in the enemy homeland. Soldiers who had spent years enduring strict rationing and blackouts in Germany were now confronted with streets illuminated more brightly than the urban centers of Hamburg, and houses with multiple rooms glowing warmly through glass panes. A visual argument that prosperity, organization, and comfort could exist not as a selective privilege but as a widespread societal reality. Each passing mile deepened the cognitive dissonance. A persistent reminder that their worldview, once anchored in propaganda and scarcity, was being tested against an undeniable, visible truth. Upon arrival at the camps in Texas and Oklahoma, the prisoners were introduced to facilities that further challenged the mental frameworks they had carried from the battlefield. Camp Hearn, for instance, was not a Spartan enclosure fenced with barbed wire and overseen by grim sentinels. It was a deliberately planned settlement, a small city built from the ground up in mere months to accommodate thousands of men with thoughtful attention to their daily needs. Barracks constructed from abundant lumber rose in neat rows, outfitted with electricity, steam heat, and plumbing that included flush toilets and hot showers. Comforts that many German soldiers had never imagined existing outside the homes of the elite. The layout of the camp itself, orderly streets, communal spaces, and recreational areas emphasized dignity and functionality, demonstrating that confinement could coexist with humane treatment. As prisoners walked through these spaces, the contrast with the squalid, overcrowded, and often unsafe camps of Europe became increasingly stark, revealing a philosophy of captivity that prioritized regulation, oversight, and welfare over punishment or humiliation. The hospitals within the camps became another site of astonishment and quiet introspection. Prisoners who had witnessed rudimentary field care or the scarcity of medical supplies in Africa were confronted with modern surgical equipment, x-rays, and fully stocked pharmacies, where treatment was administered promptly and professionally. The presence of penicillin, freely used to treat infections, represented a form of technological and medical capability that had previously existed only in rumor or legend, challenging the soldiers' understanding of both science and societal priorities. Here, they were confronted not only with the reality of care extended to enemies, but also with a philosophical paradox. A society capable of producing and distributing medical resources on such a scale could afford to treat its adversaries with competence, compassion, and consistency, and it did so as a matter of routine rather than exceptional circumstance. Daily life in the camp extended these lessons in unexpected ways. Kitchens, stocked with walk-in refrigerators and equipped with electric mixers, ovens, and dishwashers, operated under regulations that ensured surplus preparation and equitable distribution. Prisoners assigned to culinary duties were instructed to adhere strictly to these protocols, sometimes discarding food to guarantee that rations were not just adequate but reliably consistent. An act that combined abundance with discipline and a profound statement about systemic capability. Work assignments in fields and factories introduced prisoners to mechanization and industrial productivity on a scale far beyond their European experience. A single combine harvester could replace the labor of an entire regiment, and production lines turned out food, vehicles, and equipment at speeds that rendered conventional calculations of labor, time, and scarcity almost meaningless. Every interaction, from the handling of tools to the management of schedules, emphasized a principle previously unacknowledged in their military education. Efficiency, comfort, and technological sophistication could coexist with equity, and the strength of a nation was measured not only in its armies, but in the capability of its infrastructure to support and sustain human life. By living within these systems day after day, the prisoners began to internalize a reality that words alone could never convey. Their captivity became an education, a quiet yet relentless argument against the ideologies they had once held sacrosanct. Each shower, each hot meal, each electrically lit room and operational hospital contributed to a growing awareness that a society could possess unmatched power without relying on fear. Deprivation, or totalitarian control. The structured freedom and the visible prosperity surrounding them undermined notions of heroism tied to suffering and reframed their understanding of strength, not as the capacity to deny or destroy, but as the ability to create, sustain, and improve the lives of all its members. In this environment, the prisoners found themselves re-examining assumptions, questioning doctrines, and gradually recognizing that true power lay not in domination but in the systems and values that allowed a nation to thrive, even when faced with global conflict, and that captivity in such a society was not a punishment but an education in the astonishing breadth of human potential. As the months progressed, the German prisoners found themselves gradually integrated into labor programs that were framed as both practical assignments and subtle lessons in the realities of American society, a transformation that quietly eroded the rigid ideological structures that had defined their worldview. Trucked daily from the camps to farms, factories, and industrial plants, the men were allowed, without blindfolds or unnecessary supervision, to move through the heartland of a nation whose scale, organization, and prosperity defied everything they had been taught to expect. On vast cotton plantations in Texas, soldiers like Unteroffizier Herbert Lang, whose family had tilled German fields for generations, observed single machines processing in an hour more cotton than entire villages could produce in a month. The rhythmic operation of mechanical harvesters replacing human labor with a speed and efficiency that seemed almost magical, yet was entirely real. They saw farmers operating tractors and trucks with the same casual ease that they might expect from a horse in their homeland, and even adolescent children drove powerful machinery without fear, embodying a society in which technological fluency was both a practical necessity and an ordinary expectation. This exposure to mechanized agriculture shattered assumptions about the necessity of scarcity and suffering, which had long been embedded in German military doctrine and propaganda, reinforcing the narrative that sacrifice and privation were inherent virtues. Observing American farms, with irrigation systems, electrically powered equipment, and organized labor, the prisoners recognized that wealth and productivity were not concentrated in the hands of a privileged few but spread broadly across ordinary citizens whose access to technology and resources was taken for granted. Young men and women worked alongside veterans and elders, managing machinery and processing crops in ways that highlighted coordination, planning, and the cumulative effect of decentralized effort, revealing an economy where innovation and scale replaced hierarchy and coercion as the engines of productivity. For soldiers accustomed to rigid command structures, limited resources, and a culture that glorified endurance through deprivation, this was not merely surprising, it was ideologically destabilizing. Factories presented a similar revelation. In cities and industrial centers, prisoners witnessed automated production lines, assembly systems, and mechanized distribution processes that outstripped anything in Germany. At the Campbell soup plants, small crews, often consisting of women and older men, operated machinery that produced more food in a single day than entire European factories could in weeks, illustrating that labor efficiency was amplified not by numbers alone but by intelligent design, technology, and organization. Near Detroit, the prisoners helped unload coal while glimpsing the Ford River Ridge complex across the river, a sprawling industrial ecosystem producing tanks, aircraft engines, and vehicles at a pace that seemed almost superhuman. The juxtaposition of men working under humane conditions, enjoying reasonable hours and access to leisure, with the sheer output of the factories, underscored the reality that a free society could generate unprecedented power not through caution or scarcity, but through systems designed to maximize human potential. Every interaction, from the cotton fields of Nebraska to the industrial centers along the Great Lakes, revealed layers of social and economic structure that were entirely at odds with the prisoners' prior understanding of national power. In the sugar beet fields of the Midwest, they observed combines moving across fields larger than entire German counties, executing the work of hundreds of laborers in a fraction of the time, while adolescent sons of farmers operated machinery that dwarfed any tool they had used in their own villages. Conversations with these young Americans, casual and unguarded, emphasized the cultural expectation of continuous improvement. Tractors that German officers considered remarkable were described as ordinary, with better models arriving regularly, illustrating a society in which abundance, innovation, and progress were anticipated and normalized rather than exceptional. The contrast between these realities and the German experience of scarcity, rationing, and glorified suffering was stark, and it reinforced a growing awareness that the ideological underpinnings of their homeland sacrifice as virtue, deprivation as moral necessity, were not universal truths but carefully constructed myths. Prisoners also saw the consequences of these systems for the broader community. The efficiency and mechanization freed ordinary Americans to serve in different capacities, contributing directly to the war effort without enduring the privations that German soldiers had been conditioned to accept as unavoidable. Observing ordinary citizens living in prosperity, driving cars, consuming goods, and participating in civic life, the POWs could not ignore the implicit message. A society that empowered its population, invested in infrastructure, and encouraged technological literacy was capable of producing both material abundance and military capability simultaneously. In workshops, farms, and factories, they noted how labor specialization, mechanization, and resource management were coordinated on a scale that Germany's centralized, hierarchical approach could not match, providing a tangible demonstration that the myths of American weakness propagated by Nazi propaganda were not merely false, they were diametrically opposed to reality. The psychological effect of these labor programs was cumulative, reinforcing lessons introduced during transit and initial camp exposure. Each day of observation, each task performed, and each interaction with ordinary Americans quietly dismantled long-held assumptions about superiority, competence, and societal resilience. Men who had once viewed deprivation and struggle as virtues now understood that strength could emerge from abundance, ingenuity, and cooperative effort, and that true power lay not in the capacity to enforce suffering, but in the ability to generate wealth, sustain health, and mobilize resources with unparalleled efficiency. The labor programs did more than occupy time or supplement the American workforce. They served as an immersive, unintentional re-education, allowing prisoners to witness a society operating at peak productivity. Technological sophistication and social equity. A society whose very existence contradicted the ideologies that had brought them to war. By the time the labor rotations concluded, the prisoners carried with them more than fatigue and experience. They carried a profound awareness that the principles underpinning American industrial and social strength were incompatible with the dogmas of Nazism, and that their understanding of the world, once rigidly defined by propaganda, had been irrevocably transformed through observation, participation, and the undeniable evidence of prosperity in action. When the war finally ended and the guns fell silent across Europe, the German prisoners of war who had spent months and even years in the United States began their journey home. They returned to a homeland ravaged by conflict, cities reduced to rubble, infrastructure decimated, and the people themselves burdened by the weight of defeat. shame, and hunger. Yet among these returning men, there was something unique. They carried with them more than memories of combat or captivity. They carried first the knowledge of a society that had combined power, efficiency, and humanity in ways that their own homeland had never achieved. This knowledge was not theoretical. It had been lived, observed, and experienced in the course of daily life in American camps, farms, factories, and towns. Each meal, each shower, each electric light, and every encounter with ordinary citizens had functioned as an education, one that no textbook or lecture could have matched. They had seen that a nation could be both technologically advanced and socially responsible, both industrially productive and committed to the welfare of its people, and both capable of enormous power and remarkable compassion. Returning soldiers like Hans Kroll, Walter Holstein, and countless others became unintentional ambassadors of this lived experience. The lessons of mechanized agriculture, efficient factories, and community-driven prosperity translated into ideas that would shape the rebuilding of post-war Germany. Men who had once been indoctrinated to believe in sacrifice, scarcity, and rigid hierarchies now understood that human labor, when empowered by tools, technology, and organization, could create abundance. They had witnessed the value of decentralized production, innovation, and the systematic use of resources in ways that Germany's centralized wartime economy could not match. These were not abstract principles. They were practical examples of how an industrial society could operate at peak efficiency, while maintaining human dignity. As they reintegrated into German society, many carried these lessons into their careers, influencing agriculture, industry, and education with methods observed during their captivity, bridging the gap between German experience and American innovation. Perhaps most profoundly, these former prisoners had also witnessed democracy and the exercise of freedom in ways that left indelible impressions on their understanding of governance and civic responsibility. In camps, debates about post-war reconstruction, access to newspapers and books, and the ability to question authority revealed a stark contrast to the totalitarian rigidity of the Third Reich. Ordinary citizens treated them with courtesy, generosity, and respect, even in the midst of wartime hardship, demonstrating that societal strength did not require coercion or fear but could emerge from trust, accountability, and the equitable application of systems. This exposure planted seeds of belief in governance that valued human life and dignity, lessons that would later inform the reconstruction of political institutions, the drafting of labor policies, and the rebuilding of civil society in West Germany. These men became living evidence that a nation could wield power not through oppression, but through participation, education, and technological progress, a lesson that would resonate deeply during the economic and political rebuilding of the country. The impact of their American experiences was particularly visible in the so-called Wirtschaftswunder, or German economic miracle of the 1950s, the rapid recovery of industry, agriculture, and infrastructure owed as much to these returning individuals as to financial aid or external investment. They had acquired practical knowledge of mass production, mechanization, supply chain efficiency, and labor organization that, when applied in post-war Germany, accelerated reconstruction in ways that might have seemed impossible otherwise. Agricultural techniques, assembly line practices, and management philosophies were transplanted from observation and participation in the US, proving that human capital, especially knowledge gained through lived experience, was as crucial to recovery as capital investment or policy reform. Their stories, shared with colleagues, family, and the next generation of workers, seeded a culture of innovation, efficiency, and resilience that became a hallmark of post-war Germany's resurgence. Equally important, these men returned with a new understanding of what a humane society could look like. The profound idea that a community could combine productivity with care, abundance with ethics, and wealth with accessibility. They had seen that prosperity did not require oppression, that technological and industrial power could coexist with human decency, and that societies could generate wealth while providing dignity to every individual, including former enemies. These lessons inform not only industrial and agricultural policy but also cultural expectations, civic responsibility, and the value of equitable governance, leaving a lasting imprint on the fabric of a nation rebuilding itself from the ashes of authoritarianism. In conclusion, the journey of German POWs in America stands as one of the most remarkable and unintentional educational programs in history. They arrived as soldiers of a regime convinced of its superiority, indoctrinated to see scarcity as virtue and oppression as strength, and left as witnesses to the astonishing potential of a free, democratic, and industrially capable society. They carried these lessons home, shaping the economic recovery, social reconstruction, and political evolution of post-war Germany in ways that extended far beyond their immediate experience. The transformation of these individuals from indoctrinated combatants to informed participants in a democratic industrial society underscores the profound power of observation, experience, and human ingenuity as tools of education, persuasion, and lasting impact. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. If you found this story compelling, do not forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to continue exploring fascinating stories that reveal how ordinary people and extraordinary circumstances can shape the world. Your support helps us bring more insightful and engaging content straight to you every week.